So, class, this is a presentation regarding the book Peace Now by Rodri Jeffries Jones. Get right into it. So, the introduction talks about Lady Bird, President Johnson, and Eartha Kitt. Lady Bird Johnson enlisted 50 women in the fight against crime. President Johnson stated the American mothers should recognize their own responsibility to combat juvenile delinquency. Eartha Kitt, who was one of the 50 women that was enlisted, stated her views against President Johnson's views. Because she did not agree, she was categorized as a bad mother, a fornicator, a user of profane language, and an improper person with offensive opinions in a powerless race. Now, when it came to her being categorized in a powerless race, I must admit I got offended because she is an African American, and so am I. And also, she's a woman. So when you come to the conclusion that someone is powerless, then you may want to be careful who you're addressing in that instance because that can be very offensive. Next slide. Chapter 2, the social consensus. I'm going to just talk about one point in this. So the different groups that were discussed in this chapter were students, African Americans, women, and organized labor in the domestic debate. Basically, when it came to the social consensus, it was categorized in these four groups, which these are very powerful groups. Students who have their own opinions, African Americans who is a minority race, women who are considered the weaker sex, and an organized labor, which means the working class, had something to discuss in this chapter, which brought up the social consensus basically on the subject of the Vietnam War. Now we will go on to students in chapter 3. One point that I want to talk about in this one was in President Nixon's first term, students' feelings against the Vietnam War reached a pitch of intensity, summed up in the headline, Pigs Shoot to Kill, Bystanders Gunned Down, describing an incident near the University of California, Berkeley. In a speech of President Nixon's, he addressed the students by saying the Congress should give the police more money and students should hit the books or hit the road. Now, I found that not only very offensive, but I found that very degrading because as a president, I don't think that anyone should have to be subjected to this type of behavior. And I thought it was very irresponsible of him to say those words in that regard. Moving forward. Chapter 4 talks about African Americans. One African American that was brought up was Muhammad Ali, which we all know was a very powerful person in that time, and he was also a heavyweight boxing champion. But because of his views, he was barred as a heavyweight boxing champion and he was also imprisoned. And in that time, unfortunately, African Americans really didn't have a say as to what could or couldn't happen in their lives. So the ones that were radical and did things on behalf of their race had some problems in that regard. Next slide talks about women, which one I am a woman. So of course I can relate to this. And one of the points in this chapter was saying women were effective opponents in the Vietnam War. Now, I thought about this. As far as being a woman, of course, you have men who are enlisted in the war, such as your husbands or your sons or your nephews or whomever you deem as important in your life. And so, of course, I would see why women were opponents of the war because they didn't want their men out there fighting for something that they may think was an effortless fight. Chapter 6 talks about labor. And I'm going to bring up one point in this. It said labor thus furnished the basis for significant political strategy and appealed to the mythical jingoism of the inarticulate. So when it comes to being the inarticulate, I guess you can talk about people who really didn't have a voice when it came to the labor laws or when it came to anything regarding war or anything of that magnitude. So they probably just surveyed them because they really didn't have too much to say on that consensus. The last chapter in this book talks about minority mentalities and the Vietnam War. And the one point I want to bring up in this is saying by looking at the Vietnam War in terms of the four social groups, it is possible to see the localities are important to the shaping of the foreign policy. So the four social groups again were women, students, African Americans, and the labor forms, which means that people that were working, people that were students, people that were black, and women were making up the four social groups. So they basically surveyed them regarding the war, the Vietnam War. Thank you so much for listening. In the bibliography, I have Peace Now, which was the book I chose by Rodri Jeffries Jones. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to comment on this video. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and the rest of your day.